So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Termination for Convenience, how to prepare your settlement proposal. My name is Peter Ford. I'm a partner with PilieroMazza, and with me today is my colleague, Meghan Leemon. PilieroMazza is a business law firm dedicated to servicing the needs of government contractors and commercial entities. We are headquartered in DC. We have offices in Annapolis, Maryland, and then both Meghan and I work out of an office that we have in Boulder, Colorado. We really have four main practice groups: labor and employment, corporate law, litigation, and what we're most well known for is government contracts. And that's really the focus of today's webinar: government contracts and how the government has this unique right, so to speak, to terminate them for convenience. So we'll start by discussing what is a T4C, what do you do when you get a T4C, what's your potential recourse, meaning what's your ability to recover costs, settlement proposal, when does it get submitted, what should it be, what should it include, what about if you have subcontractors, then we'll touch on audits as well. But yeah, so welcome, and again, thank you again for coming out today. There is a text box, I believe, if you want to insert questions. We may answer them as we're going along. If not, we'll save some time at the end, but if we don't get to your question for some reason or another, today at least, we will get back to you. Either Meghan or I will send you an email. And with that, I'll turn it over to Meghan.
Thanks, Peter. Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to first start by just going over, what is a termination for convenience. Presumably, you all are familiar with government contracting, either as a prime or as a subcontractor. But very unique to the government contracting prime contract space is this termination for convenience right. It's essentially an unlimited right that the government has in order to terminate a prime contract at any time for any reason. Hence the termination for convenience kind of, key phrase. It allows the government to terminate or cut short the life of the contract, really for any or no reason. Common, it's done in order to avoid spending money on future performance. If some of the rights or the services that the government is receiving has changed, or they no longer have a need for such services, the government can terminate the contract in whole or in part for its convenience. Really, there doesn't have to be specifically a reason. It just allows the government to terminate a contract at any time. And this can be done, like I said, at any time. It doesn't have to be done, at the end of a certain period of performance, prior to an exercise of an option. It can be done at any time. So while this is done at any time and can be done for any or no reason, we often get a question of, okay, well, what if there's a performance issue on my contract? Well, typically the government would issue a default termination. So essentially you've breached termination, or there's some cause. Termination for cause or termination for default are the two common terms used there. But that doesn't, even if there is a performance issue, that doesn't necessarily mean that the government is going to terminate you for default. They may just ultimately decide this relationship isn't working, they're moving on. So typically the convenience termination is done when there is not an issue with performance, because if there is, the government will typically issue a termination for default. But sometimes if there are pending performance issues, or the relationship, like I said, isn't going well, the government might exercise a termination for convenience, or you could work with the government to essentially arrive at a termination for convenience settlement, i.e. okay, we'll terminate you, contractor, for convenience, but it might be maybe a no-cost termination for convenience. So the termination for convenience is a very broad right that the government has in all government contracts. So it's definitely something to be mindful of as you're performing and understand the risks associated with that. Next slide. So in terms of how the process kind of all works, the government would have to provide you with written notification, either electronically or through certified mail, that it's terminating your contract for convenience. The FAR outlines certain items that the termination notice must include. So it must state that the contract is being terminated for convenience or default potentially, and the contract clause that's authorizing the termination. The effective date, the extent, because like I mentioned, you can be terminated in whole or in part. So you need to be mindful of any possibility that certain portions of your contract will still continue. Maybe there are certain orders issued under an IDIQ and the government is only terminating, one order, even though you have two, or it's only terminating a part of your contract. You need to be mindful of that because you don't want to run into a situation where you're obligated to continue performing on a certain portion and you stop performing. So you definitely want to be mindful of that, as well as the effective date. The effective date is going to be key to determining your costs in your settlement proposal in terms of costs incurred after the effective date may or may not be recoverable depending on what they are. So being mindful of the effective date, if you have a lot of staff on the contract and the government, let's say, has provided you 2 weeks, do you then need to go and give 2 weeks notice to your employees, your staff? What are you going to do with them? Can you move them elsewhere? So being mindful of the scope of the termination, the effective date, if there's any special instructions that the government is providing to you in terms of what to do, if you have to turn something over, finish something up, things along those lines. The termination notice should also outline the steps that you should take to minimize the impact on personnel. We'll get into this a little bit later, but essentially you have you have a duty to mitigate damages. So once you're on notice that the government is terminating your contract for convenience, you need to do all that you can to try to replace or move those personnel to different contracts, to get out of any lease agreements you have. What if you purchased equipment? Things along those lines. It's very important that you be mindful that after a certain date, the government is no longer liable for any of these costs, more or less. So you need to take as many steps as you can to try to reduce whatever cost you're going to submit in your settlement proposal to the government. We often get a question of, can we challenge this termination for convenience, right? In short, yes, but there's only a certain bases where you would be successful. So a government decision to terminate a contract, either for convenience or default, is the final decision of the government. So essentially, if you're familiar with the Contracts Disputes Act, if you file a claim, you have to wait for the final decision, or you're supposed to wait for the final decision of the contracting officer before you go and file any subsequent appeal of such decision. In a termination notice, the termination is the final decision. So it's essentially, it starts your clock in terms of filing a formal appeal. As it relates specifically to a termination for convenience, you would have to demonstrate that the termination for convenience either was done as an abuse of discretion or in bad faith. These are incredibly high standards to meet, as government personnel are presumed to act and operate in good faith. If you are alleging that the government has abused its discretion by terminating your contract for convenience, we would need to be looking at bad faith. Is there a reasonable basis for the decision? How much discretion is given, which, like I said, is a lot. and whether there was any violation of applicable statute of regulation. In terms of bad faith, you essentially have to prove that the government acted with malice or with an intent to injure your company. Again, these are incredibly high standards. So while it is theoretically possible to challenge and appeal a termination for convenience, it is not likely to be successful absent some type of smoking gun or something along those lines. That said, we're happy to discuss, your individual circumstances and the circumstances that led to whatever termination. But given that the government has this unilateral and essentially unfettered right to terminate your contract for convenience, unfortunately, there's not much that you likely can do about it in terms of keeping the contract going. And it's just a risk that you undertake by doing business with the federal government. So the way to kind of recapture and make yourself whole, more or less, is through the settlement proposal process, which we'll get into in a little bit. So once you get the termination notice, what do you do? Well, the FAR outlines the certain duties that you have to undertake once you receive a certain notice. You have to stop work immediately if, to the extent, depending on the effective date of the termination. So again, it's critical to look at that. If it's 2 weeks from now, okay, well, you need to kind of wind down, but you obviously can't stop performing immediately. So you need to look at the effective date and figure out how and when you're going to stop performance. You also should notify and turn around to your subcontractors, to the extent you have any, immediately. Hopefully your subcontract includes some provision, something along the lines of saying, to the extent the prime contract is terminated for convenience, that will flow down to the subcontractor and they'll be held to the same terms and conditions of such, something along those lines. Because you don't, as a prime, don't want to be liable to a subcontractor if the government has terminated the work that includes the sub's work for convenience. You want to make sure, similarly, that you're terminating all subcontracts related to the portion. So not just provide notice to the subcontractor, but also start, winding down your subcontracts as well. Make sure you look at your subcontract for any notification requirements. If the government is asking for any notices, make sure to adhere to those as well. If for some reason there are any circumstances that could preclude your ability to stop work, you need to notify the terminated contracting officer immediately. Make sure you keep performing, as I said, the continued portion of the contract, and submit any REAs for the continued portion. Once a contract is terminated in part, depending on how the type of contract, how you priced it, that could impact some of the pricing and things along those lines. So you want to be mindful of that if you receive a termination notice. Make sure you take any action necessary to protect and preserve property that the government has or may acquire an interest in. So essentially, especially if you have government furnished equipment or property, make sure that you have that and you can return it. But also if there's something that you are going to be delivering to the government, they're going to want to acquire that prior to closing out the contract. Let the TCO know in writing if there's any commitments or any other subcontracts related to termination portion, because you'll have to include subcontractor costs in your termination for convenience settlement proposal, and that can include additional administrative time, working with the sub to prepare these proposals and things along those lines. So it's a good idea to give the government a wide understanding of the types of costs that you might be including. Try to settle any outstanding liabilities or proposals. And then once you're ready, submit your own settlement proposal with supporting documentation, as well as the inventory. You want to make sure that you're disposing or returning or doing whatever you can as authorized by the government. So when you're preparing your settlement proposal, there are two different types. you can either submit it as on an inventory basis, which is the government preferred method, or on a total cost basis, which does require prior approval from the contracting officer. Use of an inventory basis, like I said, is preferred. And under this basis, the contractor can propose only costs allocable to the terminated portion of the contract. And the settlement proposal has to itemize those items separately. So things like metals, raw materials, as well as engineering costs, G&A costs, cost of settlement with subcontractors, settlement expenses, and then any other proper charges. On a total cost basis, you can use this, like I said, if it was approved in advance. And it might be approved if for some reason, or for example, the production hasn't commenced, but the accumulated costs represent planning and pre-production or like somewhat get ready type expenses. If under your accounting system, unit costs for work in progress or finished products can't be established, if the government doesn't specify unit prices, or if the termination is complete and involves a letter contract. So just keep in mind the type of termination settlement proposal that you want to use. Inventory is more common, it is the preferred method, but you do have a couple options and forms to use. Ultimately, the cost should come out the same, but it's just the level of detail and information that you have to provide to the government. In terms of the timeline and dates and timeframes to be mindful of, so once the termination is effective, within 120 days, you should submit a complete termination inventory schedule. Then within 6 months after the effective date, you should submit subcontractor termination claims. And within 1 year from the effective date of the termination, you should submit your complete settlement proposal, which includes your subcontractor cost. Now, these times can be extended if you get approval from the termination contracting officer. And I will also caveat this 1 year settlement proposal timeline, as oftentimes the government urges contractors to submit their settlement proposal much earlier to try to settle this, close it out, and move on. Under the FAR, you are permitted the full year and potentially longer if the TCO grants you an extension. That said, you might, we'll get into, but a settlement proposal is more or less a negotiation with the government. So it's up to you to decide how much you want to push back if the government asks for a quicker submission. Also keep in mind, the complexity of your termination. If you received a notice of award, and then let's say a protest was filed, and so basically you really didn't do much, and then however much time goes by and the government just decides, we're scrapping this, we're moving over, we're terminating your contract for convenience. You likely don't have many costs associated with the contract. So you probably don't need a full year to prepare your settlement proposal. So the government may ask for it from you in 30 days or 15 days or however long. So just be mindful that you do have a year, but the government could ask you to submit it earlier, and it might be in your best interest to try to prepare it sooner rather than later. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Peter.
Thanks, Megan. So now we'll delve into contract recourse, and we'll start by discussing cost recovery. And just keep in mind as we're going through all of these contract recourse slides, discussing cost recovery in particular, the whole point of your termination settlement proposal and the types of costs that you can incur, it's all intended to make you whole. So at the end of the day, this is really an exercise in compiling a lot of cost information. And this includes pre-contract costs that you incurred, for example, to get geared up to perform the work, and perhaps you didn't recover them because your 5-year contract ended up being a 2-year contract because it was T4C. It includes the value of any equipment that then becomes the government's, or that you retain but lost your useful life on it for the time that it was dedicated to the contract. You may have leases or idle facilities that are effective. Megan talked about subcontractor claims. And then you've got your direct and indirect costs, and you've got all the effort that it takes from both internal and external resources to help settle this thing. So all of those should be recoverable costs subject to certain cost principles. One of the points I do want to make about the pre-contract cost is there is a 4-part test for recovery. One, the cost must be incurred prior to the effective date of the contract. 2, the cost must be incurred directly pursuant to the negotiations and anticipation of contract award. An incurrence of the cost must be necessary to comply with the proposed delivery schedule. And then finally, the cost must have been allocable if they were incurred after award. So something to keep in mind when it comes to pre-contract costs, but you can recover them. Slide. So again, I mean, this is really just an exercise with the goal of making you whole, and it you know, what you're putting forth in your settlement proposal is obviously going to be subject to negotiation. But Meghan, I mean, the things that you can recover, you got to make sure they're allocable, and reasonable. You have your direct costs, your indirect costs, profit. I'll touch on profit a little more. Losses even come into consideration. You can even assert a claim for increased costs due to certain contract changes. But the point is that the onus is really on you to prepare this termination settlement proposal. So spend as much time as you need, because what you don't want to do is submit something and then the government is raising issues that you could have discovered and hopefully fixed had you done a little more due diligence on the front end. Because you want to go in, again, it's a negotiation, and with any sort of negotiation, you want to go in with your strongest position at the outset, and even be mindful of certain things that they may come back and question in terms of how, you know, for example, how did you determine that that's your profit? So it's just something to keep in mind, and the same applies when you're dealing with your subcontractor. I mean, the exercise really isn't that much different. You want to do your due diligence on your subcontractor just as much as due diligence you want to do on your own costs, because you want to address those issues up front. And frankly, I would argue it's even more important with your subcontractor because you're not privy to all of their information. So if you have questions, you should ask them. If you think there are issues, you should bring them up to their attention, because you don't want to submit something that has issues in it, and the first time they come up is when the government is pointing them out to you in response to receiving your T4C proposal. Slide. So we'll talk a little bit about termination inventory, where you cannot otherwise use materials outside of the contract, or if you can't divert them to another contract and remove them from the claim entirely. You're going to end up needing to furnish the full list of property and equipment, and that's whether it was government furnished or not, to the government. And once they have this full list, this full inventory, and they really understand what the equipment is, then you'll start having discussions with the government about how to best disposition the equipment and that material. And that it could be a number of ways. I mean, that could be you selling it and crediting it to the government, meaning crediting it to your termination settlement proposal. It could be you buying it from the government in certain circumstances, or they could just ask you to destroy it or get rid of it, or you could actually furnish it back to the government. I guess the point is it obviously depends on the specific circumstances and whatever he wants to do with the equipment, and ultimately just the inventory itself can become a negotiation in part in and of itself, but it's certainly an exercise that you have to do, and it's facilitated by the standard form SF 1428 that's listed on this slide, as well as other information that you submit. Slide. With subcontractors, again, Meghan touched on this a bit earlier. But it really is of utmost importance that prime contractors are flowing down these T4C provisions into their subcontracts. And this includes vendors, suppliers, consultants, not just those who you would typically categorize as a subcontractor. And again, the point is to make sure that where the government has this quote unquote unusual bargaining chip and the ability to unilaterally terminate your contract for convenience, that you are positioning yourself to have the same kind of right vis-a-vis your subcontractors and your vendors and your suppliers in the event that there is a T4C. Because the last thing that you want is for your subcontractor to say, well, hey, I know that you had this right, or the government had this right to T4C you, but you didn't build that into our subcontract. So if you terminate me, even though you were also terminated, I'm going to accuse you of breaching the contract. Obviously, that's going to create a whole other set of problems. So I think making that language, making sure that language gets into your subcontracts, your consultant agreements, your vendor agreements, your supplier agreements is really key. And as I mentioned, with a subcontractor, you're going to go through a very similar process in submitting your TSP information to the government. The timeline for that, as Meghan kind of pointed out, is a little more truncated. You're looking at 6 months versus the overall 1 year for the ultimate prime submission. But one thing to keep in mind is, as a prime contractor, the onus is really going to be on you to make sure your subcontractor's proposal is hitting all the right marks. Meaning, is it hitting all the right marks, checking all the boxes in terms of reasonableness, allowability of all the costs involved, etc. You really, again, I'll just harp on this again. I mean, you need to really do your own due diligence to see if there are any issues with what the subcontractor is presenting. So these issues aren't coming to light for the first time once the proposal has been submitted to the government and you get their initial response. So I do want to talk a little bit about profit and losses as well. The general rule here is that you are entitled to recover profit on the work that's been completed. And that's really where it stops. So you're not entitled to recover the anticipatory profits that you're going to obtain in the future, or your lost profits. That's really only applicable in a breach of contract situation. There's limitations on the work in process type materials when the contract was terminated, but anything that's been delivered and performed on that, you're definitely entitled to profit. But again, I mean, beyond that, you're typically not entitled to profit, so it is very limited. For example, you can't get profit on your settlement situation or settlement expenses. So, I mean, this is really just another situation where you want to work closely with the TCO. I mean, help them to justify the profit. Just don't throw it out there, because the more work that you put into this, and I think more often than not, most COs are reasonable in this regard. They understand, for example, that you're operating a business for profit, and they are willing to work with you. You just need to do your own due diligence and make sure that what you're putting together is well documented, it's persuasive, and you've really vetted all of the potential issues that could arise, and you've addressed them. Real quickly on losses, Fred, you can go to the next slide. There are provisions that account for the fact that contracts may not be profitable. And so if it's a loss situation, then generally you're supposed to be reducing the amount you can recover, and you will be held to reduce that amount by the anticipated loss. Again, not the whole loss, but the component or a prorated portion of the loss that you would have otherwise incurred had this contract been completed. It's really up to the point where it was terminated in terms of the loss situation. The next thing we're going to talk about the various methods of settlement that the government can use. You can have a negotiated agreement where the parties reach a principal business solution on the termination settlement proposal. The termination contracting officer could just make a determination, which is, I'm going to tell you what you're going to get, and you're probably not going to like it. And then you can cost out under the vouchers using the standard form for cost reimbursement contracts, or you may be using a combination of these methods to reach a settlement. Depending on the complexity of the matter, you may want to do a rough order of magnitude to make sure that when you get to the end, there's actually going to be funds available to settle the matter. Obviously, you don't want to do all this work and spend all this time and effort and get to the end only to have the government tell you that your position is justified, but unfortunately, we don't have enough funds to pay you. But typically, once the government receives the proposal, they're going to review it. They're going to do a financial audit. They're going to confer with counsel. And obviously, the ultimate goal is to negotiate a resolution. But unfortunately, sometimes that's not possible for one reason or another. And you may be forced to go through the dispute resolution process, meaning filing a claim, and if that gets denied, filing an appeal of that contracting officer final decision. But I mean, again, if you approach this kind of in an amicable situation, understanding that they have these rights, and you provide them with all the documentation that you need in a timely manner, and you're making efforts to help them understand the issues and why hopefully they aren't issues in the first place, you won't have to get that far, meaning you guys can reach in negotiation and that final resolution without having to go as far as to file a claim and potentially have to take that to litigation.
Okay, so one area that we wanted to expand upon that Peter touched on briefly is essentially a settlement by determination. So this gives the TCO the authority to issue a settlement unilaterally. If this would occur if the TCO and the contractor are, for some reason, not able to reach an agreement, or if your proposal is submitted late or you fail to provide adequate information, essentially they'll just have to kind of go with what they have internally and issue that decision unilaterally. So the TCO should give you notice at least 15 days, typically through certified mail, but I guess it could be through email, to submit written evidence by a certain date substantiating the amount that you have previously proposed. If you guys are just really not able to reach an agreement, the TCO can issue this settlement by determination. You are permitted to appeal any settlement by determination unless you just completely fail to submit your settlement proposal or timely request an extension. So if you just ignore, the settlement proposal process, don't submit something, and then the government issues a determination and you don't agree with it, you've somewhat lost your right to take issue with that. So it's important to make sure you're documenting your costs following the settlement proposal process, because the last thing you want to be in is a situation where the government says, we're not paying you anything, or we're paying you a lot less than what you think you're due, and you might not have any recourse for that. So this is a right that the government has under FAR 49109-7. So just keep that in mind. You absolutely should be responsive to any request for information, documents, things along those lines. And just with any claim, legal fees that you incur in order to fight the settlement by determination are not going to be recoverable. So you don't want to put yourself into a hole by not providing the documentation, not working with the TCO, and arriving at a situation where you might have this settlement by determination. Something else to keep in mind is price adjustments for any remaining work. So if your contract is terminated in part, that could definitely impact the cost of performance for any unterminated work. You want to make sure that you're submitting any price adjustment that you might need if your contract is still going to be continuing. And you'll also have to validate that the amounts that you're seeking in a price adjustment are not also included in your settlement proposal. You can't get double recovery. So if you're including like a G&A expense in your settlement proposal, you can't then go and add that exact same G&A expense to your price adjustment, because you'd essentially be getting paid twice for something. So you need to be able to prove upon request that you're not double recovering these costs. So again, the government is going to ask you to substantiate any price adjustments, show where the costs are moving over if they're not in a settlement, if you're not including them in a settlement proposal and you're just including them in the contract cost, or vice versa. One of the next things we wanted to touch on is audits, in terms of the permissibility of these costs at both the prime and the subcontract level. So the TCO is allowed to order audits of settlement proposals of both the prime and the subcontractors. Any proposals submitted with claim costs over the certified cost or pricing data threshold are required to be audited. Which is around, it's 100,000. But any proposal that you submit, even if it's under 100,000, can still be audited at the TCO's discretion. So it is best practice for you as a prime, especially if you have a subcontractor, to audit any of your subcontractor proposals regardless of value. So you want to be performing your own due diligence, and if you see something that doesn't look right, shouldn't be claimed, or they're claiming too much or something along those lines, you can try to get ahead of the issue and try to avoid some delay, unwanted scrutiny from the government. So that is definitely something to keep in mind. And as Peter mentioned, the costs that are associated with your audit of the subcontractor's proposal could be considered an allowable cost for you as the prime, and could be recoverable as part of your settlement proposal, because you are permitted to include reasonable expenses associated with preparing the settlement proposal. Obviously, if you have to audit a subcontractor's proposal, that's a cost associated with the settlement proposal. So you should be permitted to receive those costs or recover those costs that you spend auditing your subcontractor's proposal. So just keep in mind that essentially it's more or less treat the settlement proposal as a claim. Ultimately, it might have to be converted to a claim, but keep in mind that you're asking the government for payment. You need to be able to substantiate the costs that you're entitled to. You don't want to have any double counting. You don't want to include an incorrect cost. So it definitely takes time, and you don't want to just submit costs willy-nilly. There needs to be documentation and support for that, because it's very likely that your proposal could be audited or questioned regardless of the amount. So the last thing we wanted to touch on is certain common contractor pitfalls in terms of preparing settlement proposals, or just not being more or less prepared. You want to retain supporting documentation for your cost. If you have to prove the cost that you're entitled to, so if you don't have those documents, the government doesn't have to essentially believe you without the supporting documentation. So you need to be able to demonstrate your cost. Make sure as a prime, you're passing through or flowing down any rights to similarly terminate your subcontractor. At a minimum, your subcontract should say the prime has the, this subcontract can be terminated at any time to the same extent as the prime contract is terminated. You don't want to find yourself in any situation where there is a chance that for some reason the subcontractor could claim their subcontract doesn't terminate, even if the prime contract does. it's pretty standard to include a provision in the subcontract regarding a termination for convenience right, particularly if it's as a result of the government issuing a termination for convenience. But just be mindful of that and flow it down to your subs as appropriate. Certain lack of planning or foresight or weak cost controls, disorganized. Again, this all kind of goes back to just making sure you're organized, having the right documentation in place. In terms of inadequate proposal coverage, so you want to document assumptions, any notes regarding cost considerations. You also want to look at, how was your proposal developed as well in terms of pricing, especially if you're being terminated in part. Is the proposal clear what costs were going to what personnel and for what? So keep in mind that you just need to be detailed in your cost. You want to act in a very timely manner, especially if there's been changes or delays or any issues with performance that could impact your settlement proposal. You want to make sure you're staying on top of it. While you still have that full year to submit your proposal, it might not be a good idea to wait that full year. You want to make sure you're planning your price analysis of any special tooling, fixtures, or equipment. And you want to audit your subcontractor proposals. Don't just rely on your subcontractor's statement that they're entitled to certain costs. You need to be mindful of that because you're going to be ultimately the one passing it along. Some other pitfalls, flawed assumptions, want to make sure you're understanding your cost and pricing model. The base period for cost of contract performance. So what if your contract is terminated in year one and your pricing was developed in a way where you're acquiring items in year one, but they're not going to be used until later years, or you're incurring costs in the first year, but you're not going to recover all of that into later years. These are all things you need to think about. When did you start incurring your cost? What are they for? Is it directly attributed to the contract and the scope of work required by the contract, or did you just go ahead and incur unnecessary costs too early? Things along those lines. Don't just start, just because you've been awarded a contract or are bidding for a contract, doesn't mean you should start entering into lease agreements or purchasing equipment or things along those lines. And are you buying it too early? What if you don't need that equipment until subsequent option years? Things to keep in mind while you're incurring costs that you may ultimately try to recover and pass on to the government. Make sure those are costs that are directly attributed to a contract that you have been awarded. If the government isn't going to reimburse you essentially or pay you for costs that you incurred in anticipation of that. That is everything that we had for you. I don't see too many questions. I think one question was just about the slides, and we'll work with our marketing department on that. But if there's nothing else, thank you all for attending today. We really appreciate it, and have a great rest of your day.
Yep, and I'll just say you have our contact information, or this is our contact information. If questions do arise, feel free to reach out to either Meghan or myself, and we'll get back to you. And yeah, everyone have a great rest of the week and happy holidays.